On the evening of the 9th of October 1983, 19-year-old Timothy Coggins left his home in Spalding County, Georgia, expecting an ordinary night with friends. He never came back. What happened over the next several hours was so brutal that even experienced investigators struggled to comprehend it. Timothy was chased, tortured, and murdered with unimaginable cruelty before his body was abandoned along a quiet, rural road. For more than 30 years, his family waited for answers. Witnesses stayed silent. Evidence gathered dust. Rumors spread throughout the community, but no one was ever arrested. Then, decades later, a forgotten investigation came back to life. Advances in forensic science, determined investigators, and people finally willing to speak uncovered a crime rooted in hatred, violence, and fear. This is the story of the murder of Timothy Coggins. Timothy Coggins was born in 1964 and grew up in Spalding County, a largely rural area south of Atlanta, Georgia. Friends and relatives remembered him as cheerful, outgoing, and hardworking. He loved cars and spent much of his free time with friends around Griffin, a small city where everyone seemed to know one another. Like many young adults, Timothy was beginning to build his own future. But there was something else about his life that made him different in the eyes of some people in his community. Timothy was black. He was also known to socialize with white women. Today, that fact may not seem remarkable, but in parts of rural Georgia during the early 1980s, racial prejudice still lingered beneath the surface. Old attitudes had not disappeared, and crossing racial lines could provoke dangerous reactions. No one imagined just how dangerous. On the 9th of October 1983, Timothy spent the evening with friends before heading toward Griffin. At some point during the night, he encountered two white men. Investigators would later determine that these men were William Moore and Bill Caston. According to evidence uncovered years later, the encounter quickly turned violent. Timothy was attacked. Rather than killing him immediately, the men forced him into a pickup truck. What followed was a prolonged and horrifying assault. Investigators later learned that Timothy was dragged behind the moving vehicle along rural roads. The torture lasted for miles. He suffered catastrophic injuries. Eventually, the attackers stabbed him repeatedly before leaving his body beside a road near Sunnyside, Georgia. The crime scene revealed extraordinary violence. His body showed multiple stab wounds and severe injuries consistent with being dragged over pavement. The murder shocked local investigators. It was unlike anything many of them had ever seen. Police immediately opened a homicide investigation. Detectives interviewed witnesses and examined physical evidence. Several people in the community quietly suggested possible suspects. Rumors circulated almost immediately. Some claimed the killing was racially motivated. Others whispered about men who had openly expressed anger toward Timothy because he associated with white women. But rumors are not evidence. Without witnesses willing to testify or enough physical proof to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt, investigators found themselves trapped. The case slowly lost momentum. As months became years, leads dried up. Evidence remained in storage. The investigation eventually became another unsolved murder. For Timothy's family, every birthday, every holiday, and every passing year came without justice. His mother continued, hoping someone would finally tell the truth. Time changed many things. Witnesses moved away. Relationships ended. People who once feared speaking became older. Technology improved. Most importantly, investigators refused to completely abandon the case. In 2017, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation reopened Timothy Coggins' murder. Cold case detectives reviewed every document, every photograph, and every interview conducted more than 3 decades earlier. They also began conducting entirely new interviews. This time, something was different. People started talking. Some witnesses admitted they had remained silent for years because they were afraid. Others said they believed enough time had passed. The wall of silence that had protected the killers was beginning to crack. Investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that Timothy had been targeted because of race. Multiple witnesses described conversations from years earlier in which suspects allegedly expressed racist views. According to investigators, William Moore had been angry that Timothy spent time with white women. Witness testimony painted a disturbing picture of racial hatred escalating into murder. As detectives continued rebuilding the timeline, forensic evidence also played a role. Although decades had passed, preserved evidence from the original investigation was re-examined using modern forensic techniques. Combined with witness statements, prosecutors believed they finally had enough to move forward. In October 2017, 34 years after Timothy's death, authorities arrested William Moore. Shortly afterward, Bill Caston was also arrested. For Timothy's family, the news came after decades of uncertainty. Justice had not arrived quickly, but it had finally begun. The trial revealed disturbing details. Prosecutors argued that Timothy had been deliberately hunted because of racial prejudice. Witnesses described conversations that supported the state's theory that racism was the driving motive behind the attack. The jury heard evidence about Timothy being dragged behind a truck, stabbed repeatedly, and abandoned on a rural roadside. The brutality was difficult to hear. It was equally difficult to understand how such a crime had remained unsolved for so long. The defense challenged witness credibility, pointing to the decades that had passed since the murder. Memories fade. Stories change. But prosecutors argued that the combined evidence formed a consistent and convincing picture. After hearing the testimony, the jury agreed. In 2018, William Moore was found guilty of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and concealing a death. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bill Caston later pleaded guilty to felony murder and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after serving the required minimum time under Georgia law. More than 3 decades after Timothy lost his life, the legal process had finally reached its conclusion. The murder of Timothy Coggins became more than just another solved cold case. It exposed how fear, racial hatred, and silence can allow violent crimes to remain hidden for decades. Investigators later acknowledged that solving the case required persistence from multiple generations of detectives. The original investigators preserved evidence. Cold case specialists refused to give up. Witnesses eventually found the courage to speak. Together, those pieces finally revealed the truth. For Timothy's family, no verdict could erase the pain of losing a son and brother in such a horrific way. But after 34 years, they finally heard a jury confirm what they had always believed. The people responsible had been held accountable. Timothy Coggins was only 19 years old. His future ended on a lonely Georgia road because of hatred and violence. His case serves as a reminder that justice is not always immediate. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it depends on forgotten evidence, advancing science, and people finally deciding that silence can no longer protect the guilty. The road where Timothy was abandoned has long since returned to quiet. Traffic passes as it always has, but beneath that ordinary landscape lies the memory of a crime that refused to stay buried. For more than 30 years, Timothy Coggins waited for justice. In the end, the truth survived longer than the silence.